Yesterday, we started to learn about the Eastern Woodland Indians, focusing on the Powhatan tribe. The Eastern Woodland Indians get their name because they live on the east side of the United States. These Indians, or Native Americans, lived here before settlers from England and other countries came to the United States. So this map shows tribes and groups that lived here before we had settlers coming from Europe and other continents. Our Eastern Woodland Indians lived when our area was full of trees and forests. So that's why they get the name woodlands, because the land they lived in had lots of woods. So they're the Eastern Woodlands. Can you think about where they would be found on this map? Point to it on your screen if you think you know. Think about what color area they are in. If you said right about there, you are correct, because that's where we live in Virginia, and the Powhatan Indians were in Virginia. I remember that Maine is at the top and Florida is at the bottom, and Virginia is about halfway in between. Let's talk about those Eastern Woodland Indians. The Eastern Woodland Indians are made up of American Indian blank in the eastern United States and Canada. What do we call all those groups of Indians? If you said tribes, you are correct. They were called tribes. These tribes lived near water for, what do you think they would use the water for? Very good. They needed it for transportation so that they were able to move along the water to travel to places. They didn't have cars or airplanes to help them get around. And in that water, how did they get around? Yep, they relied on canoes. These tribes were mostly blank hunters and fishermen. What kind of hunters? Do you remember yesterday which animal I said that they used? If you said deer, you're correct. They were big deer hunters. They used every part of that deer. And they also were farmers who grew corn, squash, and beans in the garden. Do you remember who was in charge of the garden? That's right, the women. So this says the Eastern Woodland Indians are made up of American Indian tribes in the eastern United States and Canada. These tribes lived near the water for transportation purposes, relying on canoes to get around. These tribes were mostly deer hunters, fishermen, but also farmers who grew corn, squash, and beans. Great job helping me out. Now, I need some help telling about the land and the climate. So the land is what the area looks like the landscape, and the climate is the typical weather of an area. So when I look at rivers, where do you think rivers would go? Would that tell about the land or the climate? Very good. Rivers tells me about the land. There were lots of rivers that they could travel on in their canoes to go fishing and for transportation. Mild winters. I know mild means it's not too hot, not too cold. It's just right. Just like if you think about buffalo sauce, if you get hot sauce, it's really hot. And if you get mild, it's not that hot. Since it says winter, yeah, that tells me about the climate. What about mountains? Does mountains tell me about the land or the climate? Very good. It tells me about the land. Hot, humid summers. Is that the land or the climate? Yeah, hot, humid summers are typical for this area of Virginia. So in our summers, it gets pretty hot here. What about hills? Yeah, that tells about the land. Virginia has lots of hills. And coastland. Coastland means it's by the coast or water. Oh, it says land in it, so it has to go with land. So the environment in Virginia for the Eastern Woodland Indians was rivers, mountains, hills, and coastlines. And our climate, our typical weather, is mild winters with hot, humid summers. Let's review the Eastern Woodland Indian culture. So right here, I have something. What do you think this is? This is a wampum belt. It's a traditional shell bead belt that's used for storytelling and gifts. So we talked about how we get a lot of legends and folk tales from Native Americans. So this is a belt that they would use when they were storytelling. What is this picture here? You're right, it's a canoe. A canoe was the main source of transportation since most tribes were built next to a waterway. Do you remember how they built their canoes? Yes, they set a tree on fire, and a fire that they could watch carefully. And then once the wood got soft at this area right here, they would dig out that burned bark to make a canoe. So we call those canoes a dugout. What does this picture look like? Yeah, it looks like a drum. Water drums are used to make music and were made by stretching animal hide over a wooden frame. So they use that animal skin for everything. Use your resources. And this animal right here, what does that look like? Yeah, that's a white-tailed deer, and they were hunted for meat. Their skins were also dried and used in their houses for clothing. Antlers were used for knives and arrows and fishing hooks. They used the hooves to make glue. So they used every part of that deer. And remember, they used the brain to make the hides soft. The most popular homes for the eastern woodlands was a wigwam or a yahaken. However, the Powhatan lived in wood frame houses called longhouses, a yahaken, with bark and reed coverings. They were larger than a wigwam and had many families inside. Can you imagine living in this house with multiple families? So this is a wigwam that's popular. See how it has that opening to let the smoke out? And this one has two. So the Powhatans used this style house instead of a wigwam, and this is called a yahaken or a longhouse. Why do you think yahakens were made of bark and reed coverings? Very good. They didn't have a lot of materials around, so they used their natural resources in the area. So they used these saplings to build a frame, and then they used reeds and bark to make mats. And remember, in the summertime, we take this off because our climate is hot and humid. Thanks for reviewing with me today. Go ahead and do your matching activity about the Powhatans, their region, jobs, transportation, homes, climate, plant life, land, and adaptations. You can use your study guide to do the sort. There's also an additional video that's about 25 minutes from the Jamestown settlement about farming like a Native American, like an Eastern Woodland Powhatan, if you would like to watch.